So anyways, what's more important is that I properly introduce our speaker for tonight, Diane Larson, who, no, why you're shaking your head? No, no. So Diane is not only a member of our society, but she's also a volunteer. I've volunteered on some things with her and she's very delightful. I'm so happy that she, when I just kind of threw it out there, hey, do you want to give a talk? She just right away said, sure. And so thank you for doing that, Diane. So Diane is a retired researcher from both the Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS. I think the bulk of her career was with USGS, doing a lot of research on endemic plants in national parks in the Great Plains regions and probably other stuff too, along with a lot of pollinator work. So she knows bees and she's part of the bee atlas here in New Mexico as part of the cadre that's been trained up and starting to collect bees so that we can get an idea of what kind of fauna we have down here. So without too much further ado, Diane's going to talk about the diversity of pollinators, not just bees, but all kinds of other insects and maybe even some other stuff too. I don't even really know. So come on up, Diane.
Thank you.
You can put yourself on presentation mode. Okay. And people in Zoom land can actually see your face right now for a minute.
Well, nothing's
You
happening.
need help finding it?
There it is.
Yeah. No, it should be.
Nothing's happening.
There
it is. I wasn't curious enough.
Okay, we have to flip them around at top here. Okay, there we go.
There we go. All right.
That's fine.
Okay. Well, who's a pollinator? That's a good question. And I'm going to tell you that it depends. And it's not always who you think it is. This is based on an article that Jen Larson and Deb Buell and I wrote some years ago. And I want to, first of all, say thank you to Sam Droege, who identified all these insects that I'm going to be talking about, US Geological Survey, who sponsored the research, and the Park Service, who let us work on their land. So, what's pollination? It's moving tiny grains of pollen from one flower to another of the same species. What could go wrong, right? Well, as it turns out, a lot can go wrong. The pollen can be moved to a different plant species, in which case the pollen is wasted. Not only that, it can clog the stigma of the plant that it got transferred to where it shouldn't have been. So that can hit both ways. The pollen can be consumed by the insect. A lot of beetles will eat the pollen. The pollen can be used to provision nests, so the larvae of the bees are eating the pollen. And the insects can actually steal the nectar from the base of the flower without ever even touching the pollen. So there's a lot that can go wrong. And a lot of this has am I okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, thank you for stopping. So I can see that on Zoom, we are not really showing the whole presentation or just the presentation.
Oh,
So I want to
Okay.
get them set up with that. Hopefully it's that one. Okay, but then what happens to, now we got to switch it back around. See, this is why you don't allow people like me to do.
I was just thinking, thank goodness we have you, Karen.
It's such a pain in the butt because this is the only time I do it, right? So
and I would not have volunteered if I had to do that.
all right, Devin.
Yep.
You're on. This is why we have. See if that. Let me just try this and let me see if this is gonna do it. Okay, so what I'm getting is maybe we need to switch it back because I'm still getting the presentation, the presenters. version of it. And I switched around. So maybe, yeah, maybe it's screen two then, huh? Yes. Okay. All right.
So one button over there.
Now it's recording.
Because we just really the thing on the side. And how do you get rid of that?
There's probably a way to drop that down.
Yeah, I think it's got a little minimizer. thing.
Doesn't have to
Do that.
show who's
So,
there.
there.
Yep.
Okay, I don't think I can get rid of it all together. How about that?
That should be fine. Thank you. Okay, so what can go wrong? Okay, a lot. And I told you all the ways that things can go wrong. And a big part of this is that, okay, how do I move things? All right, I have to do this. Okay. The plants and the insects are working at cross purposes in a way. They don't have the same goals. And yet, when you think about it, over the millions of years, these mutualisms have developed, which is very, very cool, even though the plants have one idea and the insects have another idea. So just to give you an idea of what, this is a picture that I took off the web, and it's, you can see the credit down there. Pollen producing plants far predate bees. So cycads are the oldest living lineage of seed plants. And you probably have seen them in a botanical garden, or they don't really live here. And the cycad beetle mutualism dates to the early Jurassic, which is 200 million years ago. So that was before bees ever entered the picture, right? So this beetle and cycad interaction is one of the first you'll ever find between plants and animals. So bees came, the bees didn't evolve from their wasp predecessors until about 120 million years ago in the Cretaceous. So, and that was when the angiosperms really started to diversify. There is one cycad, this is just a fun fact. There is one cycad in North America, and it lives in Florida and a little bit into Georgia.
There's a bunch in Mexico.
Right. Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Okay, in the US part of America. But it also has a beetle mutualist that pollinates it. So that mutualism is longstanding. We all know that bees are in decline, but bees can be great pollinators. They're obligate floral visitors. They have their larvae consume pollen. They have to, so they have to visit flowers. Most of them are kind of furry, and they have barbed hairs, so they attract pollen. They can hold on to pollen pretty well. But most of them are generalists, so it's unclear that they'll always take the pollen to the right place. So this little bee fly, doesn't it look like it just carry lots of pollen? I mean, it's really, and you can see it's got a little pollen on its eye, but look at the length of the proboscis. It often doesn't even touch the pollen. It just goes in there for the nectar. But another fun fact is that the first fly that was listed as an endangered species was a flower fly. So, and flies are what pollinate the largest flowering plant on the planet, and that's the corpse flower, the corpse plant. It smells like carrion, and it attracts flies. What do you expect? I've stood next to one of these, and it's taller than me. They're gigantic. If you ever have a chance to go see one, do it. They're amazing. Beetles can carry pollen. They're strong flyers, so they could be good for cross-pollination, from carrying pollen from one plant to another, because they can fly a long distance, especially in windy conditions. But they also tend to eat flowers. So it's unclear sometimes whether it's a net gain or, a lot of butterflies depend on nectar, the ones that actually still eat when they're adults. And a lot of them lay their eggs on flowering plants. They don't have a lot of structure to their body that would carry pollen, and that's but they do sometimes carry pollen. It's been shown, but they don't seem to be like they aren't built to carry pollen the way bees are, for example. Moths are a different story, but I did not do any work at night. So I think that's a whole picture that I can't tell you about, but it's really important. So does this wasp look like it could carry pollen? It looks pretty, but you can see it's got pollen on it. Doesn't look very adapted to carrying pollen, but it's got pollen. But this one looks like it's trying to rob this flower of its nectar without actually going into the actual the open flower. What's happened with wasps is the predatory ones have been really gotten a lot of attention because of what they do in for biocontrol and that sort of thing. But so I think there's a lot to be learned about wasps, that their pollination potential is probably underestimated. And just to push that point a little farther, you've all probably seen Asclepias subverticillata. It came up in the gravel in my yard, so I think it must be everywhere. And I see lots and lots of wasps on this species. But milkweeds, as you all know, have pollinia, which are these waxy little pieces, clumps of pollen, basically, that stick to the insect. And so little tiny insects can actually get weighted down by this and can't fly once they get a certain amount of pollinia on them. So actually, wasps can be very good pollinators for Asclepias, and that's been demonstrated in the Midwestern US on a different species of Asclepias. We often find ants on flowering plants. This is a sort of an overachiever, a little. This was in Costa Rica. It's a leafcutter ant that is carrying a flower across a deck. But the thing about ants, a lot of them secrete a kind of a substance from their metaphloral gland, and that it's actually toxic to pollen. So even if they're on the plant and they're visiting and they're getting pollen on them, a lot of the species the pollen dies before it can get anywhere. So they can be poor pollinators. Although there are studies that have shown, especially in Great Britain, of ants that are good pollinators for different. So there's always an exception. It's kind of interesting that way. The other thing about ants, though, they don't have wings. So outcrossing is kind of not something they're going to be very good at. So I'm going to give you a little bit of research that we did at Badlands National Park in South Dakota. And this is where you can see, this is the park, and it's located right there in southwestern South Dakota. And the different spots or stars and circles and triangles, those are the plots we had in and I'll talk more about those in a minute. And the Badlands sparse vegetation is the yellow bits, and the western wheatgrass prairie is the blue, which you can I don't know if you can make it out from there, but the point is that it's all intermingled, but they're big areas of very sparse vegetation that would probably remind you of the Bisty Badlands in New Mexico. there's just not a lot growing there, but there is stuff growing there. It's just sparse. So this is Badlands sparse vegetation. We were studying 3 endemic species that were found in Badlands National Park. And if you know about the Great Plains, there aren't very many endemic species because, you know, the wind just blows everything all the way across, and the bison carried everything across, and there just wasn't a lot to cause endemism. But there are a few in Badlands. And so this is Astragalus berrii, Eriogonum visseri, and this is the flower of Ericomeria perrii. And I chose those because they rhymed. So we had 4 plots centered on each of these endemic species. So we had a total of 12 plots. They were 1 hectare each, and we did 74 surveys, May through October in 2010 and 2011. And then on the wheatgrass prairie, this is the prairie, the wheatgrass prairie, and it looks like any other prairie. We had 12 1-hectare plots there, and we only did surveys in 2012. But there we were looking at the difference between an invasive species, Canada thistle, which thankfully there isn't very much of it here, Canada thistle versus areas not invaded by Canada thistle. So we combined all the data from these 2 different studies done in this national park. So our methods, each of those 1-hectare plots had 10 2-meter by 75-meter belt transects. We spent 20 minutes sampling along each of those transects, collecting any insect that was in contact with the reproductive parts of a flower, and not more than 5 insects on an individual plant, so we weren't like focusing on any particular plant. We brought them back, they were pinned, and we removed the pollen and put it on microscope slides so we could identify it. So from this, we knew the flower that the insect was collected on, what flowers the insect had visited before we captured it, if it was different than the one it was collected on, and the insect species, which Sam identified for us. So most of the bees we got to species, most of the flies, most of them actually got to species. We had really good taxonomic resolution here. So this is kind of the overall picture of what we caught. And you can see bees are the main, I mean, that by far and away, the most insects that we captured on reproductive parts of flowers were bees. But flies were right up there, wasps, beetles, ants, Lepidoptera, less so. And other was just whatever else we happened to find on a plant. It could have been a grasshopper, it could have been a mosquito, it could have been a midge. It was just any of that, a hemiptera. So if you look at this little table, this is the proportion of the insects that had pollen in these taxa. So again, the bees are the winners. 87% of them had pollen on their bodies. Beetles, 74%. Wasps, 85%. They were right up there. But look at the Lepidoptera, which were mainly butterflies, a few moths that were flying in the day, 21%. That was terrible. So not terrible, but they didn't carry a lot of pollen. Ants also, not much. And if you look at this other category, which we don't know if they were effective pollinators, we don't know much about what those guys were doing there, but they were more likely to have pollen on their bodies than the butterflies were. So anyway, that's
May I ask you a question?
yeah.
How did you capture them?
Nets. This was all net captured. Yeah. So whoops, I went too far. No, I didn't. Okay, yes. So this is just showing you graphically, and I'll tell you what all this stuff means before I go on, because you're going to see it again. So these are all the taxa: ants, bees, beetles, flies, Lepidoptera, other, and wasps. And this is the proportion or the probability that they were carrying different amounts of pollen. So the filled dots are conspecific. So that's with respect to the plant that we caught it on. So it could have been the pollen that it got from that plant. We can't tell the difference. It could have, the open ones are mixed. It had the pollen that was on the plant that we caught it on, but it had other pollen as well. The non-conspecific only was that it only had pollen that wasn't from what we caught it on, and then none of these open triangles. And again, you see that the ants and the Lepidoptera and the other, not so great. They were highly probable to not carry pollen. These are the error bars around. But on the other hand, beetles pretty likely to carry just conspecific pollen. Bees, mixed pollen was the predominant, and wasps mixed as well. So moving on from that, for now I will be ignoring the ants and the Lepidoptera and the other, because they weren't, there weren't that many of them. They weren't that likely to carry pollen. So starting with bees, now I'm breaking this down. Again, it's probability here, but this is early season sparse habitat, mid-season sparse habitat, late season sparse habitat. That was corresponding to when the endemic plants were blooming. So the early was when the astragalus, the mid was the eriogonum, and the late was the ericomeria. And then wheatgrass was just, we only did that in the middle when the pollen, the Canada thistle was blooming. So looking at bees, generalists, they're carrying mixed pollen most of the time. Mid-season wheatgrass prairie, they were actually carrying a lot of conspecific pollen.
Good question.
Yeah.
So the mixed category, that could include the conspecific pollen, but
It does.
other.
It does include the
does.
conspecific. Yeah,
Okay.
that was mixed,
Right.
what it was on. Yeah. Yeah. And then beetles, the error bars get big because there weren't as many beetles or these other species. But again, early season, the beetles weren't carrying much pollen, but mixed grass prairie, or the wheatgrass prairie, they were hot then. They were carrying a lot of conspecific pollen, and same for the mid-season sparse. So mid-season, the beetles were doing a lot better than the others. But we still had, I mean, everybody was carrying pollen, but those were kind of the winners. And flies, well, we had a lot that weren't carrying any pollen, but in those sparse in the middle of the season, we had a lot of conspecific pollen that they were carrying and mixed pollen otherwise. So flies were a mixed bag, but were pretty good for the mid-season sparse. And finally, the wasps, a mixed bag, but they tended to, even though it was mixed, they were carrying pollen in the late season sparse, which there weren't a lot of insects that were actually carrying pollen. So maybe having mixed pollen, we'll take it, okay? So the winners are, in sparse early season, the bees were the best. In mid-season, the flies in the sparse seemed to do a good job. And late season, we had the wasps that were seeming to come into their own. And wheatgrass prairie in the mid-season, we have the beetles. So what this is looking like is that everybody was carrying all of these taxa were carrying pollen, but different ones were doing a more effective job at different times and in different places. So they all have their own sort of niche, I guess, if you want to call it that. So, yeah. So I think the point of all this is that there really are benefits of taxonomic diversity. And some of those, for example, in the day versus the night, you get different species. This is a moth, but it's not at night. I'm sorry, I don't have any pictures of moths at night. But night, the xylocopus seem to be out all the time. I cannot say, this flower is a squash, and there are specific bees that focus on squash, Papinapis. I don't know if that's what this bee is, but it was out there early in the morning before the squash flowers, the nest. So everybody, these people, these pollinators are dividing things up and effective at different times of the day. And also by having lots of different opportunities for pollinators, there are, they have an increased thermal range so that some, like a lot of flies can come out and fly in the cold weather compared to some of the bees that can't so much. Bigger insects can fly in the colder weather. And when some, like we know some of the bees are being lost, maybe there's some buffering in there by other species that can kind of fill in when we're missing a few of this or that. So like this Andrina is typically an early season, and this is a Medicago in my yard, so it was there. The longhorn bees often specialize on composites, and then so they have their focus on that. Moths can, well, I've talked about moths. I don't know much about moths. The interesting about the wasps is they loved my soapberry. So they peak in late spring, but they're around through the fall. So, and this little fly, I'm gonna say, oh, the bombyliid fly, that was on a verbicina in September. So we've got a coverage throughout the season, different times. So we have things that can come in and step in. That little bee that was on the squash, well, maybe it wasn't a squash bee, but it was in there. We were working on it. So yeah, so diversity matters. And thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
So you documented the proportion that had some pollen. Did you make an effort to talk about how much pollen? And isn't that relevant?
It is relevant. We did not do that. Well, the other thing we didn't do was actually in this study, see, just because they're carrying pollen doesn't mean they're effective.
Right.
Okay, so more pollen is better, but putting the pollen in the right place and at the right time is also important. And we did measure that on the little Eriogonum visseri in a separate study. And it turned out that there's a halictid, a sweat bee, that's pretty important for that particular plant. And they're very abundant, so it's good. But it's incredibly hard to assess seed set. And that's what you have to do if you want to know if the pollination actually happened. So this is giving an indication that it could have happened. We're working on it, but maybe, yeah.
And a related question, probably also really hard to do. You heard my earlier question about the mixed versus the purely conspecific.
Mhm.
Do you have an impression of how much more effective purely conspecific is than a mixed batch of pollen? Because my guess is it wouldn't be that much more.
That depends, I think. So there's only so much room on a stigmatic surface, the surface where the pollen tube has to grow down to the ovary.
So
And so if you've got, if it's a big pollen, that's not the right pollen, it can clog it. It can be, there can be lots of reasons why it actually has a detrimental effect. So. But I mean, there are only so many ovules in a flower, right? So you only need so many grains of pollen to actually, but people have studied this and said that even though you only need so many, having more is better for reproduction. So having more pollen grains of the same, of the right species.
You might have said, but in your other category, other insects, what were some of those?
Okay, there were true bugs, the hemipterans, homopterans. Those are kind of insects that don't have much fur in my experience, so that it's hard for them to carry pollen. There are a surprising number of mosquitoes that land on flowers. They might be getting some nectar, some liquid, I don't know. Midges are very common on flowers. Occasionally, like grasshoppers, and I don't think they're doing anything. They're eating stuff. Yeah. So if you drill down into those taxa, there are more, but
That's good. That's what I was looking for. Thank you.
okay.
Do you happen to know which taxa are most likely to, like boring into a flower for the nectar without going through the anthers?
Oh,
Can you
that's
repeat that. That was kind of.
Oh, okay. So the question is, do I know which taxa are more likely to rob nectar without actually pollinating the plant, without contacting the right surfaces to carry pollen? And I've never seen beetles do that, but I've seen flies and wasps and bees. So even especially bees, yeah, the trigonas, I've seen those like just all around the base of the poor plant. I don't know how it survives.
Here's some equivalents. Got the truth.
Yeah.
I'm still pretty new on the botany hearing, so this might be a really silly question. But how can you tell that the pollen is of a species?
Oh, so.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, okay, sorry. How do you tell that the pollen was a different species? And in fact, you take it, okay, you've pinned your insect and you have a little, we used, what did we use? Little pieces of, anyway, we brushed the pollen off of the bee onto a slide, and I sent one of the people who worked with me up to learn palynology basically, and she came back and would identify some you can't tell apart, but pretty close. I mean, we collected pollen from all the flowers in our study area first, so we had a reference collection, and then we could compare the pollen that was on the bees with that reference collection. And except for some of the composites and a few others, a little bit of the Fabaceae, that we could do that.
Since you went first with not sure if it was a good question or not. So I write labels for the seed library, and a lot of times I get the information from the native plant kind of website. But I also look things up just to try and have as much information on the labels. And frequently, the plant will be described as attracts pollinators.
Mhm.
And often it says attracts butterflies. So I guess I'm just wanting to be as accurate as possible on what I put. I mean, I guess I'm just sort of wondering, well, is that even a relevant thing to put? And does it mean that people will want to plant those plants in their yard more because then they'll see the pollinators? Anyway, it's
There's
a
nothing-
many-part question, but
Yeah, so just basically you're wondering, is it being attractive to butterflies a relevant thing to
Yeah.
put on a label? Or,
and other pollinator. I mean, yeah. What would you answer to somebody that says, "Oh, you want a lot of pollinators in the garden, so you can plant these plants"? Is sort of what the label is fine.
yeah, well, I don't know which, most seed plants need pollinators unless they're wind pollinated. So, there is a, I think there's good reason that people put together pollinator mixes and for a particular area. And so they must, I don't think that's just pulling things out of the air. I think some people know what attracts a pollinator. You know, if you've got the Monarda that I used to have in my garden, it attracted tons of pollinators, and you know, the composites. And here I'm not as familiar. I've only been here a year, so I don't know a whole lot of what's attractive, but people do. Most of you do. So I assume that that's a reasonable thing to plant in your garden.
Just as an aside, the Research Society has a really nice book on planting for look. And it's a really good website. And you can go. And it describes what broad types of butterflies and what broad types of that these and so on. That's
And what site is that, Carlos?
it's the Research Society as a book on how to make pollinator.
They have a lot on their website too.
Yeah, there are actually a lot of resources. Back in Minnesota, there were like extension people who would go out and help you plant a pollinator garden. It was a big deal. So I don't know if that exists here.
So are the populations of those endemic plant species in good condition?
It's a good question. The three that we studied, I think the astragalus was probably the one that struggled the most because it tended to bloom really early, and it would often, it's a cold place, South Dakota, and the insects often were not there to pollinate it in our experience. I think the Ericameria was doing fine. The Eriogonum, as far as I could tell, was doing fine, was setting seed. Thank you very much.